The champagne glass was still in my sister's hand when she said it, loud enough for the string quartet to stop between movements, loud enough for 200 people to hear every syllable land. "To Michael," Deborah said, raising her glass toward my son, toward the white orchids and the candlelight and the life he had built for himself. "And to Sophie, who is marrying into this family despite the fact that his mother can't hold down a job to save her life." She laughed. A few people laughed with her, the way people do when they are not sure if laughing is safe, but silence feels worse. "Everyone, give it up for the unemployed one," she said, and she actually gestured toward me, glass raised, smiling with all 32 of her whitened teeth, as if she had just delivered a toast instead of a blade. I did not flinch. I want you to understand that first, because everything that came after depended on it. 200 faces turned toward the head table where I sat in a simple charcoal dress with my hands folded in my lap. And I did not flinch. I did not blush. I did not reach for my napkin to hide behind. I looked at my sister the way you look at a storm you have already priced into your plans. Somewhere behind me, a phone buzzed once against the tablecloth. I did not look down at it yet. I let the silence stretch instead, the terrible, delicious silence of 200 wedding guests deciding whether they had just watched something cruel or something they were about to regret witnessing. My name is Eleanor Hardwell, and if you are watching this and you have ever sat at a table where your own blood decided you were the joke of the evening, I want you to stay with me, because I promise you, this story does not end where you think it does. If you have ever had to hold your face still while your own family humiliated you in public, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. I read every one. But let me back up, because you deserve to understand exactly how we arrived at that ballroom, at that toast, at that single buzzing phone that Deborah Voss had absolutely no idea was about to end everything she thought she knew about her baby sister. 6 years before that night, I was a name on a security badge at Superior Retail Corporation, a company most Americans have shopped at without ever knowing the name behind the name. A mid-sized retail conglomerate with 14 regional distribution centers and a headquarters tower in Stamford, Connecticut, where I had spent 11 years climbing from financial analyst to vice president of operations finance. I want to be precise about that title, because precision mattered to me then, and it matters to me now. I ran a department of 31 people. I managed an operating budget of just under $200 million a year. I was, by every internal metric the company measured, one of the 4 most trusted finance executives in that building. And then, on a Tuesday in March, at exactly 2:14 in the afternoon, I was called into a conference room on the 9th floor and told that an internal audit had flagged $340,000 in marketing budget discrepancies traced to accounts under my authorization. I remember the exact number because I have never once in my life forgotten a number that mattered. I remember the 2 men from Human Resources who would not look at me directly. I remember my direct supervisor, a senior vice president named Malcolm Reyes, sitting at the head of that table with a manila folder in front of him and an expression of practiced professional regret. The kind of face men like Malcolm Reyes rehearse in mirrors. I told them it wasn't me. I told them to pull the approval logs, the login timestamps, the vendor correspondence. I told them that any competent forensic review would show the transfers had been authorized under my credentials on days I was documented as traveling, on a system that Malcolm Reyes himself had administrative access to. Nobody pulled the logs that day. Nobody pulled them that week. I was escorted out of a building I had given 11 years of my life to, carrying a cardboard box with a photograph of my son's college graduation and a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Boss," which had been a joke gift from my team, and which I have kept, unwashed of the memory, in every office I have owned since. I want to tell you that I fought it immediately, that I lawyered up within the hour and cleared my name within the month, because that is the story people like to hear. That is not what happened. What happened is that I went home to an empty house, because my husband Richard had already moved his things out 4 months earlier, into an apartment with a woman named Kimberly from his law firm, and I sat on the edge of my son Michael's old bed, the one we had not yet converted into a guest room, and I did not cry for 3 days. I simply sat there, doing math in my head, running the numbers of my own unraveling life the way I had once run the numbers of a $200 million budget. Michael was 21 that spring, finishing his last semester of college, and I made the decision that I have never once regretted and have also never stopped paying for, which was that I would not let him watch his mother collapse. I told him I had been laid off in a restructuring. I let the word restructuring carry the shame that the word embezzlement would have carried instead, and I let my family believe whatever version of the story made them feel most comfortable. Because by then, I already understood something that would take my sister another 6 years to learn the hard way. People do not want the complicated truth. They want a story that requires nothing of them. My sister Deborah wanted the simplest story of all. Deborah is 4 years older than me, and if you have a sister like her, you already know the shape of that particular ache. Growing up in our house in Albany, Deborah was the daughter our mother, Marian Hartwell, paraded at church functions, the one who was homecoming queen, the one who married an ambitious young accountant named Grant Voss the summer after her graduation and moved into a colonial in Westchester County with a circular driveway and a housekeeper twice a month. I was the daughter who read spreadsheets for fun, who majored in finance instead of communications, who our mother once introduced at a dinner party as, "My other one, she's very organized." I loved my mother. I want that understood clearly, because grief is rarely simple. And I loved her even as I cataloged, quietly, the 1,000 small ways she made her preference known. When word got back to my family that I had lost my job, Deborah did not ask what happened. She did not call to check on me, not once, not in the first month, not in the first year. What she did instead was find, at every family gathering for the next 6 years, a way to remind me of my diminishment, as though my unemployment were a stain on the family name that she alone had the moral authority to point out to the room. At Thanksgiving that first year, while carving the turkey, my brother-in-law Grant made a joke about how at least someone in the family had time to make a proper pie crust now. And Deborah laughed and said, loud enough for my mother's church friends to hear over dessert, "Well, somebody has to be the unemployed one." I remember setting down my fork very carefully. I remember Michael, 22 years old that year, looking at his plate with his jaw tight, too young and too afraid of conflict to say anything in front of his grandmother's guests. I said nothing either. I told myself silence was strategy. Some years, I am not sure it was anything more than fear. The phrase followed me. At my mother's 75th birthday, Deborah introduced me to a woman from her book club as, "My sister, she's between things right now." And when the woman asked what I used to do, Deborah answered for me, cheerfully, "Oh, she was in finance, but that didn't really work out, did it, Elle?" And she squeezed my shoulder, the way you might pat a dog that has disappointed you, but that you still, technically, love. At my mother's funeral, 3 years ago now, when I stood at the reception afterward accepting condolences in a plain black dress, my sister leaned toward a cluster of our mother's oldest friends and said, "Eleanor's still figuring out her next chapter," with a small, apologetic laugh, as though my grief and my unemployment were the same inconvenient fact, requiring the same practiced explanation. I did not correct her. Not once in 6 years did I correct her. And I need you to sit with that fact for a moment, because I know some of you watching are doing the same math I once did, weighing the cost of speaking against the cost of staying quiet, and choosing quiet because it feels survivable. It is survivable. I am proof of that. But survivable and painless are not the same word. And I want to be honest with you about how much that silence cost me, even as I chose it deliberately, even as I built, underneath it, something my sister could not have imagined in her most creative moments of condescension. Because here is what Deborah did not know, what nobody in my family knew, what even my own son did not fully understand until the night the truth finally arrived at a ballroom in the Hudson Valley, wearing a champagne-colored dress and holding 200 witnesses hostage to its arrival. While my sister was calling me the unemployed one at every holiday table for 6 consecutive years, I was not unemployed. I had not been unemployed, in any meaningful sense, since roughly 14 months after that conference room on the 9th floor. What I was, instead, was invisible by design. And there is a difference between the two that took me the better part of a decade to fully understand myself. Let me tell you what actually happened after Superior Retail Corporation walked me out of that building with my cardboard box. I did not immediately fight the accusation, but I also did not simply accept it. I am, by training and by temperament, a person who trusts evidence over emotion. And so, in the 18 months that followed my termination, while I told my family I was job hunting, while I let Deborah believe I was drowning, I spent my severance, $210,000 paid out in a lump sum as part of my exit agreement, doing something almost nobody expected of a disgraced former finance executive. I hired a forensic technology consultant, a quiet, meticulous man named Arthur Kessler, who had once guest lectured at a conference I'd attended, and I paid him, out of my own pocket, to help me reconstruct the login trail Superior Retail's internal audit team had never bothered to pull. It took us 11 months. I want you to understand the discipline that required, because I know how these stories are usually told, with a single dramatic discovery. A single document that changes everything overnight. Real vindication rarely works that way. Real vindication is built the way a house is built, one load-bearing beam at a time, invisible until the frame stands on its own. Arthur and I found the access logs showing that the vendor account modifications tied to the missing $340,000 had originated from an administrative override credential, a credential that only 3 people in the entire company held, and that on the specific dates in question, my own badge access showed me 2 states away at a regional distribution audit in Ohio. One of those 3 credential holders was Malcolm Reyes. I did not go to the press. I did not go to a lawyer looking for a lawsuit and a headline. I went, quietly, to Superior Retail's general counsel with Arthur's documentation, 18 months after my termination, and I asked for exactly 2 things. A written acknowledgement, sealed and private, that the original findings against me had been unsupported by evidence, and my full severance package restructured as a settlement, which effectively meant nothing changed publicly except that my own conscience and my own legal exposure were finally clean. Malcolm Reyes was quietly moved to a subsidiary role 8 months later and was gone from the company entirely within 2 years. ostensibly for unrelated reasons that I have never bothered to investigate further, because I had already gotten what I came for. I tell you all of this not to dwell on old wounds, but because you cannot understand what I built afterward without understanding what that 18 months taught me. It taught me that documentation is a kind of armor. It taught me that patience, real patience, the kind that outlasts other people's assumptions about you, is a weapon most people are too impatient to ever learn to use. And it taught me most of all that I never again wanted my financial safety to depend on any single person's willingness to see me clearly. Not an employer, not a husband, not, though it would take me longer to admit this part, my own sister. So while Deborah was calling me the unemployed one at Thanksgiving, I was taking my settlement, my severance, and the 11 months of forensic consulting fees I had already sunk into clearing my name, and I was quietly building something else entirely. It started small, almost embarrassingly small for a woman who had once managed a $200 million budget. I began doing independent financial consulting for small businesses in the Hudson Valley. Bakeries and print shops and family restaurants that could not afford a full finance department, but desperately needed someone to find the leaks in their operating budgets. I worked out of my kitchen table for the first year. I told my family I was doing some freelance bookkeeping, and I let them hear exactly the diminished version of that sentence that they wanted to hear. Deborah, upon learning this, told her book club friend that I was doing some little side jobs, bless her heart. And I let that stand too, because the woman standing quietly in the corner of the room, taking notes on your failure, always has more power than the woman performing her success loudly in the center of it. Within 2 years, I had 11 small business clients and a reputation in a very narrow circle for finding money that businesses did not know they were losing. It was through one of those clients, a struggling regional print company on the verge of bankruptcy, that I met David Chen. David was the estate and corporate attorney the print company's owner had hired in a last effort to restructure before liquidation. And David and I ended up in the same conference room 3 times over 2 months, watching the same numbers from 2 different professional angles. He was sharp in the way that quiet people are sharp, the kind of lawyer who says 4 sentences in a 2-hour meeting, and every one of them reroutes the conversation. After the print company deal closed, restructured rather than liquidated, thanks in no small part to a financing arrangement I had helped structure, using a small pool of my own savings alongside a local investor, David called me and asked a question that changed the entire shape of my life. "Have you ever thought about doing this on purpose?" he asked, "instead of by accident?" I told him I did not have the capital to do it on purpose. He told me I was thinking about capital the wrong way. Over the next several months, David walked me through a structure I had understood academically for years, but had never had reason to build for myself. A holding company, formed under a blind trust arrangement, where David would serve as the registered agent and public-facing signatory on all filings and correspondence, while I remained the sole beneficial owner, entirely unlisted, entirely unnamed, in any document a curious relative or a nosy former colleague might ever stumble across. We called it North Star Holdings. I chose the anonymity deliberately, and I want to be honest with you about why, because I know some of you are wondering whether this was strategy or shame. It was both. After 18 months of being publicly accused of a crime I did not commit, after watching how quickly people, including people who shared my blood, had been willing to believe the worst version of me the moment it was offered to them, I had developed a permanent and considered aversion to being visible at all. I did not want my name on anything. I did not want a headline, a LinkedIn announcement, a triumphant return to finance with my picture in a business journal. I wanted quiet, total control over my own life, structured so completely that no single person's opinion of me could ever again determine what I had access to. David Chen understood that instinct without my having to explain it twice, which is, I think, the reason our partnership lasted. North Star Holdings acquired its first controlling stake 14 months after its formation, a regional bakery chain in financial distress, for $412,000, most of it borrowed against my severance settlement and the modest equity I had built in my consulting practice. We turned that bakery chain profitable within 18 months by doing nothing more glamorous than what I had always done: finding the leaks, cutting the waste, renegotiating the vendor contracts nobody had reviewed in a decade. We sold our stake 3 years later for $1.9 million. I am not telling you this to boast. I am telling you this because I need you to understand the mathematics of what was happening at every single Thanksgiving, every single birthday, every single time my sister called me the unemployed one across a table set with my mother's good china. Each time she said it, North Star Holdings was larger than it had been the year before. Each time she patted my shoulder and told her friends I was between things, I had, in fact, just closed on a new acquisition, or restructured a credit facility, or hired our fourth analyst, a bright young woman named Priya Nair, who had come to us from a mid-sized accounting firm and who would, though none of us knew it yet, end up holding one of the most important documents in this entire story. By the time Michael called me, 4 years after North Star's formation, to tell me he had met a woman named Sophie Prescott at a friend's engagement party in Manhattan, North Star Holdings managed just under $30 million in assets under management, spread across 11 portfolio companies, none of them bearing my name anywhere in their public filings. I remember exactly where I was when Michael told me about Sophie. I was in my kitchen, the same kitchen table where I had started this entire second life, reviewing a due diligence file on a struggling hospitality group that had recently approached North Star for emergency financing. Michael's voice on the phone was bright in a way I had not heard since he was a teenager, and he told me about a woman who worked in nonprofit development, who laughed at his terrible jokes, who had, in his words, actually asked me questions about my life instead of just talking about hers. I told him that sounded like a very good sign. I did not yet know her last name would matter to the file sitting open on my kitchen table. I would not learn that for another several weeks, and when I did, I sat very still for a long moment, the way you sit still when the universe hands you a coincidence too large to be entirely comfortable with. Sophie Prescott, it turned out, was the daughter of Walter Prescott, founder and chairman of Prescott Hospitality Group, the very company whose due diligence file was open on my kitchen table. I did not tell Michael, that night on the phone, that his girlfriend's last name had just rearranged the furniture of my entire professional life. I simply asked him more questions about her, about where she had grown up, about what her family did, the ordinary questions any mother asks, and I let him tell me, in the easy, unguarded way he always talked to me, that Sophie's family owned some kind of hotel company upstate, that her father was intense but decent, and that she rarely brought up the business at all, preferring to talk about the community garden nonprofit where she worked instead. I remember sitting at my kitchen table long after we hung up, the due diligence file still glowing on my laptop screen, feeling the particular vertigo of watching 2 separate lives I had built with great care: the quiet mother who showed up to Sunday dinners and absorbed my sister's insults, and the anonymous majority shareholder who moved $14 million through blind trusts, suddenly threatened to collide in a single kitchen in Beacon, New York. I called Priya first thing the next morning, before David, because Priya was the one who had actually assembled the file, and I needed to know, with total clarity, whether the coincidence I had just discovered created any conflict serious enough to walk away from the deal entirely. That is not a small question in my line of work. Fiduciary duty is not a phrase I use loosely, and I had built North Star Holdings on the premise that every acquisition, every rescue financing, every dollar we deployed would be evaluated purely on its merits, insulated from anything as messy as personal history. Priya, I said, I need you to walk through the Prescott file with me again, from the top, and I need you to tell me honestly whether there is any reason, structural or ethical, that North Star should not proceed. She did not know that morning why I was asking with such unusual intensity. I had not yet told her or David that the founder's daughter was dating my son. I simply listened as she walked me through the numbers again, the debt schedule, the collateral position, the 400 employees whose paychecks depended on Prescott Hospitality Group surviving its own founder's ambition. Everything about the deal was sound. Everything about it was exactly the kind of patient, unglamorous rescue North Star had built its reputation doing for 6 years. The only thing that had changed was that I now had a personal stake in its outcome that no spreadsheet could capture, and I sat with that discomfort for 3 full days before I finally called David and told him the truth. David listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when I finished, he asked me exactly one question. Does the deal change on its own merits, Eleanor, knowing what you know now? I told him no, that if anything, the diligence made me more confident, because I had now met, through Michael's stories, the kind of family that ran Prescott Hospitality Group, a founder who still personally walked the grounds of Ashford Manor before every wedding season, a daughter who cared more about a community garden than a hotel empire. Then nothing has changed, David said simply. You are not doing this for Michael. You were doing it before you knew Michael existed in this story at all. The fact that it turns out to matter to your family is not a conflict. It is simply proof that the world is smaller than we like to pretend. I have thought about that sentence many times since, because I think it is the truest thing anyone said to me in the entire 6 years of building North Star Holdings. I want to tell you, too, about the year that followed, because it was not a quiet year, not in my family, even as it was an extraordinarily quiet year inside the walls of North Star's small office in Beacon. Michael and Sophie's relationship deepened steadily through that spring and summer, dinners becoming weekends, weekends becoming a shared apartment lease in the fall. And every step of it happened while I sat, several states removed from the actual paperwork, reviewing the same company's finances under a name Sophie had never once heard. There were nights I found that strange enough to laugh about, quietly, alone in my kitchen. The particular dark humor of being simultaneously the most important stranger in a young woman's life and her boyfriend's own mother. Deborah, meanwhile, did not slow down. If anything, learning that Michael was seeing hotel people, as she insisted on calling them, seemed to sharpen her appetite for reminding everyone, at every opportunity, exactly how far the distance had grown between my life and my nephew's fiancé's family. At Christmas that year, hosted at Deborah's house in Westchester with its 7-foot tree professionally decorated in gold and white, my sister pulled me aside in the kitchen while I was drying dishes, ostensibly to help, and said, in the low, confiding voice she used whenever she wanted an insult to sound like concern, "You know, Elle, I really do worry about how this is going to look. Michael marrying into a family like that. And you, well, you know." She did not finish the sentence. She never had to. I dried another glass, set it in the cabinet, and told her I thought Sophie was lovely, and that I was very happy for Michael. and I watched my sister's face flicker with something like disappointment that I had refused, once again, to give her the reaction she had been fishing for. Grant was at that Christmas too, distracted for most of the evening, checking his phone in a way I now understand, with the clarity of hindsight, was almost certainly connected to whatever quiet financial pressure was already building at Prescott Hospitality Group, and in whatever private ledger he was keeping of his own losses. I remember him mentioning, almost offhandedly over the cheese course, that he had some complicated refinancing happening at work, and Deborah, half listening, told him not to bore everyone with business talk on Christmas Eve, and the conversation moved on to something about the neighbor's renovation. And none of us, least of all me, understood in that moment how close we were sitting to the exact fault line that would eventually crack open at a wedding 18 months later. Michael proposed to Sophie the following spring, on a Saturday morning in April, at the community garden where she volunteered, kneeling in a plot of newly turned soil with a ring he had saved for over a year to afford properly on his own salary, refusing, gently but firmly, my offer to help with the cost, because he wanted, he told me, to give her something that was entirely his. I cried when he called to tell me, real tears, the uncomplicated kind. And I remember thinking, even in that joy, of the parallel timeline running underneath it. The closing documents David and I were finalizing that same month for a $14.2 million rescue package for a company Michael's future father-in-law had built with his own hands and very nearly lost through one bad bet on a mountain nobody had asked him to climb. Sophie called me herself 2 days after the engagement, before she had even told most of her own extended family, and asked if we could have lunch, just the two of us, because she wanted, she said, to get to know the woman who had raised the man she was going to marry. We met at a small cafe in Beacon, not far from North Star's offices, though of course she had no reason to know that, and she spent most of that lunch asking me questions I was not used to being asked, about what I had been like at her age, about what I had wanted before motherhood and marriage rearranged my ambitions, about whether I had any advice for a 25-year-old about to build a life with someone. I told her the truest thing I knew, which was that the only relationships worth keeping were the ones where you did not have to shrink yourself to be believed. I did not tell her why I knew that so completely. I simply watched her nod, slowly, as though she were filing the sentence away somewhere she intended to return to, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, entirely unguarded in front of another human being who was not my son. It was during that same lunch that Sophie mentioned, almost in passing, that her father had been under enormous stress the past year, something about a resort investment that had gone badly, and that she worried about him more than she let on, because he had built Prescott Hospitality Group with his own hands, starting with a single inherited property, and she could not bear the thought of watching it slip away from him after everything he had sacrificed. I remember holding my coffee cup very still, listening to my future daughter-in-law describe, without any idea that she was doing so, the exact company sitting inside a due diligence folder on my laptop at that very moment. I told her only that I hoped things worked out for her father, and I meant it with an intensity she could not have understood, because by then I already knew that whether things worked out for Walter Prescott depended, in no small part, on a decision that was mine alone to make. I signed the term sheet for North Star's rescue financing 11 days later. Prescott Hospitality Group operated 6 boutique hotels and event venues across New York and Pennsylvania, the crown jewel of which was Ashford Manor, a restored 19th-century estate in the Hudson Valley that hosted, among other things, roughly 90 weddings a year. Walter Prescott had built the company over 3 decades from a single inherited inn into a respected regional hospitality brand. But 18 months before Michael ever mentioned Sophie's name to me, Walter had made an aggressive, over-leveraged bet on a ski resort expansion in the Smoky Mountains called Blue Ridge Alpine Lodge, and the project had collapsed under cost overruns and a disastrous opening season, leaving Prescott Hospitality Group carrying debt it could not service. The company's chief financial officer, the man responsible for managing that debt, for finding a rescue partner, for keeping 90 weddings a year and 400 employees afloat while the whole structure threatened to come apart, was named Grant Voss, my sister's husband. I want to pause here, because I know this sounds like the kind of coincidence that strains belief, the kind of thing you would roll your eyes at in a novel. But if you have spent any real time in finance, you already know that regional business worlds are far smaller than people imagine. New York's hospitality and hotel finance circle is a tight one. Grant Voss had, in the 2 years before he ever came looking for rescue financing, built a modest reputation as a competent, if overextended, CFO, trying to keep a family hospitality business alive through a series of increasingly desperate refinancing efforts. When Grant's outside financial advisors began quietly shopping Prescott Hospitality Group's distress to a small circle of regional private capital firms, David Chen was one of the people they called, because North Star Holdings had, by then, developed a reputation of its own. A very specific reputation, actually, for rescuing distressed regional businesses with patient, unglamorous capital and no interest in a public press release. Grant Voss never met me. That is the detail I need you to hold on to, because it becomes important later. Every phone call, every meeting, every document exchanged in the 6 months of negotiations that followed happened between Grant Voss and David Chen, or between Grant Voss and Priya Nair, who by then had become North Star's lead analyst on hospitality assets. My name appeared nowhere. I reviewed every financial statement Grant's team submitted. I built the model that determined the rescue package terms. I made the final call on valuation. And Grant Voss, brilliant, exhausted, drowning Grant Voss, negotiated across a conference table for 6 months from a man he believed was David Chen's silent institutional partner, some anonymous fund he pictured, I would later learn, as a group of gray-suited men in a Manhattan tower. North Star Holdings closed on a $14.2 million rescue financing and restructuring package for Prescott Hospitality Group 9 months before my son's wedding, in exchange for a 61% controlling equity stake. I became, quietly, invisibly, the majority owner of the company that employed my sister's husband, the company that owned the venue where my son would marry Walter Prescott's daughter, the company whose survival, whose 400 jobs, whose 90 weddings a year, now depended in no small part on decisions I alone had the authority to make. I did not plan this. I want to be honest about that, because I know the tidy version of this story would have me engineering the whole thing as an elaborate revenge scheme, and that is simply not what happened. What happened is that I built a life so quietly competent that it eventually intersected, by ordinary business logic and terrible coincidence, with the family that had spent 6 years calling me a failure. I did not choose Prescott Hospitality Group because Grant worked there. I chose it because it was a sound, patient investment in a well-run hospitality brand suffering from one bad expansion decision, exactly the kind of asset North Star had built its entire reputation acquiring. The fact that my son fell in love with the founder's daughter 8 months after the deal closed was not a plan. It was, I have come to believe, simply the universe developing an excellent sense of timing. What I did control, carefully, deliberately in the months that followed, was what everyone in that story would and would not know. I told David Chen, when Michael first mentioned Sophie's last name, that I needed him to keep our entire relationship with Prescott Hospitality Group exactly as anonymous as it had always been, at least until I decided otherwise. David, who had watched me build North Star from a kitchen table conversation, did not ask why. He simply nodded, the way he always did when I gave him an instruction that required no explanation, and he made certain that not one filing, not one board memo, not one line of correspondence at Prescott Hospitality Group ever connected the name Eleanor Hartwell to the 61% stake now sitting quietly at the top of their capital structure. I met Sophie for the first time at a dinner Michael arranged 4 months into their relationship at a small Italian restaurant in Beacon, New York, and I remember being struck immediately by how little she resembled the family I had built in my head from Grant's negotiating style. Sophie Prescott was warm, in a way that felt entirely unpracticed, the kind of warmth that does not perform itself for an audience. She asked me questions about my consulting work, my real consulting work, the small business clients I still kept even as North Star had grown. And she listened to the answers instead of waiting for her turn to speak. Somewhere in the second hour of that dinner, she reached over and squeezed my hand and said, "Michael talks about you like you're the smartest person he's ever met. I can already tell why." I did not tell her that her family's company owed its survival that season to a woman she had just met over pasta. I did not tell her because it was not yet the right time, and because I had learned, across 18 months of forensic patience clearing my own name, that timing is not cowardice. Timing is discipline. But I want you to understand that I loved Sophie Prescott from that very first dinner, independent of any of it, independent of the deal, independent of her father's company, because she was kind to me in a season of my life when kindness from strangers had become rarer than I liked to admit. The wedding planning unfolded over the following year exactly the way wedding planning does in families that have money and families that pretend to. Deborah, delighted that her nephew was marrying into what she immediately and loudly referred to as old hospitality money, inserted herself into every planning conversation she could reach, offering opinions on floral arrangements and seating charts with the confidence of a woman who believed proximity to wealth was the same thing as possessing it. At a family dinner 8 months before the wedding, Deborah told our cousin Patricia, within my hearing, that she was so relieved Michael found a family with some actual stability after everything. And the everything hung in the air the way it always did, an insult wearing the costume of concern. I did not correct her that night, the same way I had not corrected her for 6 years. And I want to be honest that the choice was growing harder to make rather than easier, the closer the wedding drew. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from holding 2 truths in your body at once. The quiet triumph of a life you built entirely on your own terms, and the old, practiced flinch of a woman still absorbing insults at her own family's table, because peace, even a false peace, had once felt safer than the alternative. Michael noticed it too that season, in ways he had not noticed it before. At a bridal shower Sophie's mother hosted at Ashford Manor's smaller garden room 2 months before the wedding, Deborah spent much of the afternoon holding court among Sophie's college friends, describing Michael's childhood in a version so polished it barely resembled the one I remembered living. And when one of the young women asked, politely, what I did for work, Deborah answered before I could open my mouth. "Oh, Eleanor keeps busy," she said, waving a hand as though swatting away a fly. "Little bookkeeping projects here and there, very flexible schedule, which has been wonderful for the family, honestly. Someone needs to be available." I watched Sophie's jaw tighten from across the room, the same tightening I had begun to recognize as her particular tell, and I watched Michael, standing near the gift table with a stack of cards in his hands, go very quiet in a way that told me he had heard every word. He found me afterward, in the hallway near the coat closets, and he asked me, in a low voice, why I let her talk about me like that. "You could tell them the truth, Mom," he said. "Any part of it. That you run your own company, that you've been supporting yourself just fine this whole time. Why do you let her keep doing this?" I told him the truth I had been telling myself for years, that visibility was a risk I had decided, after everything Superior Retail Corporation put me through, I was not willing to take again. That I had built an entire life specifically so that no single person's opinion of me could ever again determine what I had access to. And that included, whether he liked it or not, his aunt's opinion. He did not entirely accept that answer, and I remember the particular frustration in his face, the frustration of a grown man watching his mother absorb something he desperately wanted to fix on her behalf and could not. One day, he said, "I hope she says it in front of the wrong room." I did not tell him, standing in that hallway, how close that day already was, or how strange it felt to hear my own son unknowingly forecast the exact shape of what was coming. I want to tell you, too, about a smaller moment from that same afternoon, because it has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from those months. Sophie's grandmother, a sharp, quiet woman in her late 80s named Eleanor Prescott, which is its own small coincidence I noticed the very first time I heard it, pulled me aside near the punch table and told me, without any preamble, that she had been watching my sister talk over me for the better part of 2 hours, and that she wanted me to know she had not missed a single instance of it. "I raised 4 daughters," she said, patting my hand with fingers gone thin and papery with age. "And I learned a long time ago that the quiet one at the table is very rarely the weak one. She is usually just choosing her moment." I have thought about that sentence often since, delivered by a woman I barely knew in a garden room full of wedding china, because it was, in its own small way, the first time anyone outside my own carefully constructed life had ever articulated back to me the exact philosophy I had spent 6 years quietly living by. The months that followed that bridal shower moved with the particular compressed velocity of final wedding preparations, dress fittings and seating charts and menu tastings folding into one another until the calendar itself seemed to accelerate toward the second Saturday in June. Deborah's commentary did not soften as the date approached. If anything, the proximity of the wedding and the growing certainty in her mind that our family was about to be permanently and publicly associated with what she called old hospitality money sharpened her need to draw a clear line between her own successful marriage and my diminished one, as though the wedding itself were an audit of the family's worth, and she intended to make certain everyone understood exactly where each of us fell on the ledger. I let her keep drawing that line, quietly, the way I had let her draw it for 6 years, because I had already decided, long before that bridal shower, that whatever reckoning eventually arrived would arrive on my terms and my timeline, not out of spite, but out of the same patient discipline that had rebuilt my entire life out of a cardboard box and a coffee mug 6 years earlier. Grant, for his part, treated me at these gatherings with the mild, distracted condescension of a man too busy managing a genuine financial crisis to bother performing much cruelty of his own. He would ask occasionally, in the tone of a man making conversation rather than actually curious, "Still doing the bookkeeping thing, Eleanor?" And I would say yes, still doing the bookkeeping thing, and I would watch him check his phone for the 4th time that dinner, a man drowning quietly in a company he did not know I already owned the majority of. I want to tell you about one dinner in particular, 6 months before the wedding, because it planted something in me that would matter enormously later. We were at Deborah and Grant's house in Westchester, a rare full family gathering, and partway through dinner, Grant excused himself to take a call in his study. He was gone almost 20 minutes. When he came back, his face had the particular gray pallor of a man who has just been told something he cannot fix by dinner. Deborah asked, lightly, if everything was all right at work, and Grant said, too quickly, that it was fine, just a vendor issue, nothing to worry about. I remember filing that moment away without fully understanding why. I had learned, across a career built on forensic patience, that the phrase, "nothing to worry about," said too quickly, in too gray a voice, is almost never true. It would be another 5 months before I understood exactly what that phone call had been about, and by the time I did, I was no longer simply a majority shareholder reviewing routine financial statements. I was a woman staring at a discrepancy that would eventually detonate an entire wedding reception. The engagement party came 6 weeks after that strange, gray-faced dinner, held, at Walter Prescott's insistence, at Ashford Manor itself, on a terrace overlooking the same lawn where Michael and Sophie would eventually marry. I remember standing at the edge of that terrace with a glass of sparkling water in my hand, looking out at boxwood hedges trimmed into precise geometric rows, at a fountain someone had clearly restored at considerable expense, and understanding, with a strange, private vertigo, that I was standing on ground I already partly owned, surrounded by people who had no idea that fact existed. David Chen had come with me that evening too, introduced again simply as a family friend, and at one point, while Walter Prescott gave a brief, warm toast to the couple, David leaned toward me and murmured, low enough that only I could hear, "Try not to look quite so much like a woman auditing the flower arrangements." I laughed, despite myself, a real laugh, the first one I remembered having in weeks, and for a moment, the whole absurd architecture of my double life felt almost bearable. Deborah found her moment that night too, of course, because Deborah had never once let an open bar and an audience of strangers pass without finding a way to remind everyone exactly where she believed I belonged in the family hierarchy. She cornered me near the dessert table, already 2 glasses of champagne into the evening, and introduced me to a cluster of Sophie's college friends as Michael's mother. She's had a rough go of it the last few years, but we're all very proud of how she's managing. One of the young women, polite in the particular way strangers are polite to something they sense is uncomfortable, asked what I did for work, and before I could answer, Deborah patted my arm and said, "Oh, she does some bookkeeping for small businesses around here. Very sweet, very modest little operation," and laughed as though the sentence were an act of generosity rather than erasure. I smiled, said something vague about enjoying the flexibility, and watched Sophie, 20 feet away, catch the tail end of the exchange and frown, just slightly, in a way that told me she had noticed the pattern even if she did not yet understand its full shape. It was Sophie, in fact, who pulled me aside near the end of that evening, out by the fountain, away from the noise of the party, and said something that stayed with me for months afterward. "I don't know why your sister talks about you like that," she said, arms crossed against the evening chill. "But I want you to know I don't buy it for a second. Michael says you basically kept the 2 of you afloat by yourself after his dad left, on top of everything else that happened at your old job. That doesn't sound like a modest little operation to me. That sounds like the reason he turned out the way he did." I did not tell her, standing at that fountain, how close her instinct was running to the actual truth, that the very lawn behind her, the very fountain beside us, existed in its restored state partly because of a rescue package I had personally structured. I simply thanked her and told her Michael had turned out well because he had good instincts about who to trust, and I meant that sentence in a way she would not fully understand for another 5 months. The weeks that followed the engagement party fell into an uneasy rhythm I have come to recognize, in hindsight, as the particular quiet that settles over a situation just before it breaks open. Grant's evasiveness at family gatherings continued and worsened in small increments that would have been easy to miss if I had not already spent a career trained to notice exactly the kind of small, staggered inconsistency that precedes a much larger one. He canceled on 2 family dinners in a row, citing work travel that Sophie later mentioned, in an offhand way, did not quite match what she'd heard from her father about the company's schedule. He grew thinner over those months, in the particular way people grow thin when stress has replaced appetite rather than discipline. At one Sunday brunch, 4 months before the wedding, I watched him decline a second cup of coffee because his hand, resting on the table, had a faint, persistent tremor he tried, unsuccessfully, to hide by keeping it in his lap for the rest of the meal. I did not know yet what was causing it. I only knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent a career reading the small, physical tells of people under financial pressure, that whatever it was not simply the ordinary stress of managing a company through a difficult refinancing. David and I discussed it once over coffee in his office, in the abstract, professional language we used for every portfolio company under North Star's oversight. Prescott Hospitality's quarterly board reporting has been thinner than usual the last 2 cycles, David said, sliding a folder across his desk toward me. Nothing that trips a covenant, but thinner. I remember looking at the numbers and feeling a familiar, cold clarity settle over me. The same clarity I had once used to reconstruct my own vindication out of 18 months of ignored access logs. Schedule the full governance audit, I told him. Not just the debt covenants, everything. Escrow reconciliation included. I want to be honest that I did not, in that moment, suspect Grant Voss specifically of anything. North Star conducted full governance audits on every majority-controlled portfolio company on a rolling schedule, and Prescott Hospitality Group was simply next in the rotation, 4 months out from a date that happened entirely by coincidence to fall a matter of weeks before my son's wedding. I have thought many times since about how much of what followed depended on a scheduling calendar that had nothing to do with any of us personally, and how strange it is that the most consequential discoveries in a life are so often delivered by ordinary bureaucratic timing rather than any dramatic instinct. Priya took the Prescott Hospitality Group audit herself that quarter, partly because she had, by then, become our most experienced hospitality analyst, and partly, she told me later, because something about the last 2 quarters of thin reporting had quietly bothered her too, in the same wordless way it had bothered David. She began the way she always began, methodically, without assumptions, working her way backward through 12 months of escrow statements 1 line at a time. And she told me afterward that it took her nearly 3 weeks of that quiet, unglamorous labor before anything on the page gave her a reason to slow down. I want you to sit, for a moment, in the 5 months between that gray-faced phone call at Deborah's dinner table and the night Priya finally called me, with her voice gone flat and careful. 5 months in which my sister continued, at every gathering, to remind the family, and increasingly Sophie's family too, that I was the unemployed one, the modest bookkeeper, the sister who had not quite managed to keep pace with the rest of us. 5 months in which Grant grew thinner and more evasive, and in which I watched him, at one final dinner 3 weeks before the wedding, excuse himself again to take another call in another study, gone even longer than the first time, returning with the same gray pallor, the same forced, unconvincing calm. 5 months in which Sophie planned her wedding at a venue she loved, without knowing it belonged, in majority, to a woman she had already decided to trust completely, for reasons that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the kind of person I had chosen to be with her, regardless of what anyone else in my family had ever called me. I did not know, in any of those 5 months, that the trap closing around Grant Voss and the trap Deborah was unknowingly building for herself at every dinner table were the same trap, arriving from the same direction, on the same unstoppable timeline. I simply kept building, kept reviewing quarterly reports, kept smiling politely through my sister's condescension, and kept waiting, the way I had learned to wait across an entire career, for the evidence to finish assembling itself into something undeniable. It finished assembling itself on a Tuesday evening in April, 4 months before the wedding, when my phone rang at 9:40 at night and Priya Nair's name appeared on the screen. Priya Nair found it first, during a routine quarterly audit North Star conducted on all its majority-controlled portfolio companies, a standard governance practice we applied uniformly, without exception, regardless of any personal history any of us might have with the underlying business. Priya had been reconciling vendor escrow accounts for Ashford Manor and Prescott Hospitality Group's 4 other event venues, a fairly mundane task involving the deposits couples paid months in advance for weddings and corporate retreats, deposits that were supposed to sit untouched in a segregated escrow account until services were rendered. She called me on a Tuesday evening, 4 months before Michael's wedding, and her voice had a particular flatness I had come to recognize over the years as her way of controlling panic. "Eleanor," she said, "I need you to look at something, and I need you to look at it tonight." What she had found, laid out across 14 months of transaction records, was a pattern of small, carefully staggered withdrawals from the Ashford Manor vendor escrow account, each one just under the internal reporting threshold that would have triggered an automatic compliance flag. Each one routed through a secondary vendor account before ultimately landing, through 3 additional transfers designed to obscure the trail, in a personal checking account belonging to Grant Voss. The total, reconstructed meticulously over the following 6 weeks by Priya, and, eventually, by me personally, going back through records the way Arthur Kessler had once taught me to go back through superior retails, came to $86,400. I sat at my kitchen table that night, the same table where North Star Holdings had been born, and I felt something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with grief. Because I understood, sitting there with Priya's spreadsheet open in front of me, that some portion of that $86,000 was very likely money that other families, other couples planning their own weddings at Ashford Manor, had paid in good faith, trusting that their deposit sat safely waiting for the day their own daughters walked down the same garden aisle where my son would soon stand. David and I spent the following month building the case the way I had once, 18 months of my life ago, built the case that cleared my own name, methodically, without emotion, cross-referencing every transaction against vendor invoices, payroll records, and the timeline of a series of documented gambling debts we eventually traced to a casino in Atlantic City called the Golden Horseshoe, where Grant Voss had, according to loyalty program records David's investigator obtained through entirely legal channels, accumulated significant losses over the preceding 2 years. It was not difficult to understand, once we had the full picture, what had happened to a competent but overextended CFO managing a company teetering toward bankruptcy while quietly bleeding money at a card table 3 states away. I did not immediately know what to do with what we had found. I want to be honest about that, too, because I know the tidy version of this story would have me instantly plotting a dramatic reveal, and that is not who I am, and it was never who I wanted to become. My first instinct, sitting with Priya's completed audit file 4 months before my son's wedding, was not triumph. It was exhaustion. It was the particular, specific exhaustion of a woman who has spent her whole life discovering that the people closest to her keep handing her reasons to distrust them, and who has to decide every single time whether distrust is going to calcify into something permanent or whether she is going to keep finding a way to hold both the wound and the hope at once. David asked me, over coffee in his office one gray Tuesday morning, what I wanted to do. I remember looking out his window at the parking lot below and saying, finally, I want Michael's wedding to happen without this hanging over it. I told him I wanted to handle Grant's situation quietly, professionally, after the wedding, the way North Star handled every governance issue at every portfolio company, with a confidential internal investigation, restitution demands, and quiet termination if the findings held. I did not want to detonate my son's wedding day over my sister's husband's gambling debts. I want that understood clearly, because everything that happened at that wedding happened not because I planned a public reckoning, but because Deborah, standing at a podium with a microphone in her hand, decided to hand me one anyway. David agreed to hold the findings until after the wedding, on one condition. He wanted Grant quietly removed from any authority over escrow accounts immediately, effective that week, disguised as a routine internal controls restructuring that North Star was implementing across all its portfolio companies, a plausible enough cover given that we had, in fact, been doing exactly that kind of governance tightening across our other holdings. Grant would never know the real reason. He would simply receive a memo, unsigned by me, informing him that vendor escrow oversight was being centralized under a new compliance protocol, effective immediately, and that all future disbursements required dual authorization from Priya's team. Grant complied without protest, because Grant Voss, brilliant and exhausted and drowning in debts he had never told his wife about, had absolutely no reason to suspect that the invisible institutional partner tightening his company's internal controls was his own sister-in-law, sitting 3 states and 1 family dinner away, quietly closing the trap around money he had already spent. I want to be clear that I take no pleasure in describing it that way. It was not a trap I built for cruelty's sake. It was a trap built by ordinary financial governance, the same governance North Star applied to every company it controlled, and Grant simply happened to be standing inside it when it closed. The wedding itself was scheduled for the second Saturday in June at Ashford Manor, on the same lawn where, Sophie told me once with a laugh, her parents had married 31 years earlier. The morning of the wedding arrived crisp and clear, the kind of pale gold June morning that Hudson Valley photographers wait years to capture, dew still silvering the boxwood hedges when the first vendor trucks began arriving at 6 that morning. I remember standing on the terrace with a cup of coffee, watching the staff assemble white folding chairs in careful rows across the east lawn, feeling something I had not expected to feel that morning, which was peace. Not triumph, not anticipation of any reckoning, simple, uncomplicated peace, the kind a mother feels watching a life she nearly lost the ability to give her son unfold exactly the way it was supposed to. Deborah arrived at Ashford Manor a little after 10, in a champagne-colored gown that had clearly cost more than my entire outfit, hair and makeup already done by a stylist she had flown in from the city, and she found me in the bridal suite hallway, helping Sophie's mother, Linda Prescott, coordinate the timeline with the venue's event manager. "Don't you look sensible?" Deborah said, looking at my charcoal dress, the single sharp piece I had chosen deliberately from among my quietest, most understated wardrobe. The kind of dress that says nothing about you until the moment it says everything. "I always forget how practical you are about these things, Elle. Someone has to be, I suppose, since you've got all that free time on your hands these days." I smiled at her, the way I had learned to smile at her over 6 years. A smile that cost me nothing, and gave her nothing either. And I told her the ceremony would begin at 4, and that the reception dinner would follow at 6:30. And I went back to helping Linda Prescott, a woman I had grown genuinely fond of over the preceding year, finalize a seating chart that placed Deborah and Grant at a table near the dance floor, close enough to see everything, far enough that they would not notice, until it was far too late, exactly who else was seated 2 tables over. Because David Chen was there. He had been on the guest list for 11 months, quietly listed as a family friend of the Hartwells, a plausible enough cover for a man who had, in fact, become one of the most important people in my life over the preceding 6 years. Nobody questioned his presence, a soft-spoken older man in a gray suit who mingled pleasantly at the cocktail hour and complimented the flowers. Priya Nair was there too, seated at a table near the back, with several of Sophie's college friends, introduced simply as a colleague of Eleanor's, which was, in the strictest technical sense, entirely true and entirely insufficient as a description of what she actually knew. The ceremony itself was, by every account I later heard from guests who did not know what was coming, one of the most beautiful anyone present had ever attended. Sophie walked down the garden aisle on her father's arm in a simple ivory gown, past 200 white folding chairs and a canopy of wisteria the venue's grounds crew had trained along a wooden arbor for exactly this purpose. And Michael cried before she even reached him, which made half the guests cry too, which is, I have come to believe, the entire secret purpose of a wedding. I sat in the front row, beside my ex-husband Richard, who had flown in from Chicago with Kimberly, and for 2 hours that afternoon, I let myself feel nothing but the simple, uncomplicated joy of watching my son marry a woman who loved him without agenda. The reception began at 6:30 in Ashford Manor's Grand Ballroom, a restored 19th century carriage house with soaring timber trusses and 3 enormous chandeliers that the venue's staff dimmed slowly as the sun went down outside the tall arched windows. Round tables draped in ivory linen filled the room, each centered with low arrangements of garden roses and eucalyptus, candlelight catching in crystal glassware as 200 guests found their seats for dinner. I remember the string quartet playing something soft and familiar as the first course was served, salads with local greens and a citrus vinaigrette, and I remember feeling, for the first time in longer than I could quite calculate, entirely at ease in a room full of my family. That ease lasted exactly until the toasts began. The best man went first, Michael's college roommate, a warm and mercifully brief tribute that made the whole room laugh at the right moments. Sophie's sister went next, tearful and sweet, raising her glass to a sister who had always known exactly what she wanted and finally found it. Then the MC, a friend of Michael's who had agreed to keep the microphone moving efficiently, made the mistake, an understandable one, of inviting any family members who'd like to say a few words to come forward. And Deborah, 3 glasses of champagne into the evening, rose from her seat with the particular unsteady confidence of a woman who has never once in her life doubted that a room wants to hear from her. I want to walk you through exactly what she said, because I have replayed it enough times since that I can recite it precisely, and because every word of it matters to what happened next. She started warmly enough, congratulating Michael and Sophie, praising the venue, thanking the Prescotts for their generosity in hosting such a beautiful day. Then, glass still raised, she turned, deliberately, toward the head table where I sat, and something in her expression shifted into the particular brightness she always wore right before she said something cruel and called it honesty. "I have to say," she said, "it means so much to see Michael end up here, at a place like this, with a family like the Prescotts, given everything he's had to overcome." She let that land for a beat. His mother's had a hard few years, as some of you know. Between us, we've all worried about Eleanor quite a bit. It's not easy, is it, being the unemployed one at every family gathering for 6 years running? She laughed, a bright, brittle laugh, and raised her glass higher. But look at this. Look at where Michael ended up anyway. To Michael and Sophie, and to proving that where you come from doesn't have to hold you back. The room did not know how to respond. I watched it happen in real time, the particular confused ripple of 200 people trying to determine whether they had just witnessed a toast or a public execution. A few people laughed, uncertainly, the way people do when the alternative feels like admitting they noticed something ugly. Sophie's face, at the sweetheart table 20 feet away, went pale and then hard, her eyes cutting toward her new mother-in-law with an expression I would treasure for the rest of my life. Michael's jaw tightened the way it had at that long-ago Thanksgiving, except this time he was 28 years old and married, and no longer willing to look at his plate. I want to slow this moment down for you, the way it slowed down for me, because 200 people holding their breath at once makes a very particular kind of silence, a silence with texture and weight, and I have never experienced anything else quite like it before or since. Somewhere near the back, a fork clinked against a plate and then went still, as though its owner had frozen mid-bite, uncertain whether finishing the motion would be rude. The string quartet, 4 young musicians from a conservatory in Poughkeepsie who had been hired to provide unobtrusive background music for exactly this kind of evening, sat with their bows lifted just off the strings, glancing at each other, clearly unsure whether the moment called for silence or for something soft and forgettable to paper over what had just happened. The candlelight along the head table caught the condensation on my water glass, and I remember watching a single bead of it slide down the side and land on the ivory tablecloth, a small, dark circle spreading slowly, and thinking, with the strange clarity that arrives sometimes in the worst moments of your life, that I had time. I had all the time in the world, actually, because the only person in that room who did not yet understand the shape of what was coming was standing at the podium with her champagne glass still raised, waiting for applause that was not going to arrive the way she expected it to. I let my eyes move across the room, slowly, the way you might scan a room before a difficult presentation, cataloging who was watching and how. Linda Prescott, Sophie's mother, sat with her napkin pressed flat against her lap, her expression carefully arranged into the polite blankness of a woman who has hosted enough society functions to know that a public reaction is sometimes its own kind of scandal. Walter Prescott, beside her, had gone very still in the particular way large, capable men go still right before they decide something, his jaw working slightly, his eyes flicking toward his daughter and then back toward Deborah, with an expression I would later learn to recognize as the beginning of a decision he had not yet voiced out loud. My cousin Patricia, 3 tables back, had her hand pressed over her mouth. Richard, my ex-husband, seated beside Kimberly at a table near the dance floor, was looking at me with an expression I had not expected from him, something between guilt and old, unresolved tenderness, the look of a man remembering, perhaps for the first time in years, exactly what kind of silence he had left me alone inside when he walked out the door 4 months before Superior Retail Corporation ever called me into that conference room. Grant sat beside Deborah with his own champagne glass still full, untouched, his eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance, and I remember noticing, even in the middle of everything else happening in that room, that he looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with his wife's toast. He had no idea, sitting there, that his own reckoning was arriving in the same breath as mine, that the 2 of us were, without either of us fully understanding it yet, standing at the edge of the same cliff from 2 entirely different directions. I want you to hold on to that image, because it will matter again very soon. A man so consumed by his own private collapse that he could not even register the public one unfolding 6 feet to his left. Somewhere in that stretched, suspended silence, my mind did the thing minds do at moments like that, the thing I imagine happens to everyone who has ever been publicly humiliated by someone who was supposed to love them. It offered me, in rapid, unbidden succession, every previous instance of the same wound, stacked one on top of another like transparencies held up to a single light. I saw Deborah at that first Thanksgiving, carving knife in her hand, saying, "Somebody has to be the unemployed one," while my son, 22 years old, stared at his plate. I saw her at my mother's 75th birthday, squeezing my shoulder in front of her book club friend, telling the room I was between things. I saw her at my mother's funeral, in a black dress, leaning toward a cluster of our mother's oldest friends to explain that Eleanor's still figuring out her next chapter, while I stood 3 feet away, holding a box of my mother's reading glasses and trying not to fall apart in front of strangers. 6 years of the same 3 words, worn into a groove so deep I could recite the exact inflection she used every single time. And now, here they were again, delivered at my own son's wedding, in front of 200 witnesses, timed with a precision my sister could not have possibly understood, arriving at the exact moment I finally had, sitting in my own lap beneath the tablecloth, the means to answer them completely. I thought, too, in that same suspended second, of my mother's unopened letter, still sitting in the drawer of my desk in Beacon at that point, 3 years unread, and of the strange, aching symmetry of standing in a room built by another woman's father, married to another family's fortune, having spent 6 years being called a failure by the daughter our own mother had never quite learned how to stop favoring. I thought of Arthur Kessler, the forensic consultant who had taught me, all those years ago, that patience assembled correctly eventually becomes undeniable. I thought of David Chen, 2 tables over, sitting perfectly still in his gray suit, waiting for a signal we had never actually planned to give this way, this soon, this publicly. And I thought, with a clarity that surprised even me, of Sophie, 20 feet away in her ivory gown, who had never once, in over a year of knowing me, called me anything but exactly who I was. The silence held. I want you to understand how rare that is, how quickly most rooms rush to fill an uncomfortable pause with laughter or small talk or the scrape of chairs, because discomfort, for most people, is simply something to be managed away as fast as possible. This room did not rush. This room sat in it. 200 people who had just watched something ugly happen at a wedding they had dressed up for and driven hours to attend, uncertain whether the appropriate response was outrage on my behalf or polite pretending that nothing had happened at all. Somewhere near the kitchen doors, a server carrying a tray of champagne flutes had stopped entirely, tray balanced against her hip, watching the head table along with everyone else, because even the staff, trained to remain invisible during exactly this kind of event, could not help but notice that something had just shifted in the air of that ballroom, the particular electric stillness that precedes a change nobody in the room can yet name. I became aware, in that silence, of my own hands, folded in my lap exactly the way they had been folded since Deborah first raised her glass, and I made the decision, deliberate and specific, not to unfold them yet. There is a kind of power in stillness that most people never learn to access, because most people mistake stillness for passivity, when in fact the two are almost opposites. Passivity is what I had practiced for 6 years at family dinners, absorbing insult after insult, because I had decided the cost of responding outweighed the cost of staying quiet. Stillness, the kind I was practicing now, was something else entirely. Stillness was a woman who already knew exactly what she was going to do, taking the extra half-second required to do it correctly, rather than reacting the way 6 years of accumulated hurt might have tempted a lesser version of me to react. I thought of Michael, seated at the sweetheart table in his tuxedo, jaw tight. And I understood, watching him, that whatever I chose to do in the next few seconds would become one of his permanent memories of his own wedding day, layered forever over the memory of walking Sophie down that garden aisle. And I wanted, more than I wanted almost anything else in that moment, to give him a memory he could be proud of, rather than one he would spend years trying to explain away to people who had not been in the room. I wanted Sophie, too, watching from the sweetheart table with her jaw set and her eyes hard, to see exactly what kind of family she had actually married into. Not the family Deborah had just tried to paint for the room, but the one I had spent 6 years quietly building underneath it. The room held its breath. The candles burned steadily along the head table, throwing small shifting shadows across the ivory linen. And somewhere at the edge of my vision, though I did not look at it directly yet, though I let it sit there for one more suspended beat before I allowed myself to acknowledge it. My phone lay against the tablecloth beside my water glass, screen dark, waiting. But I want you to understand what was actually happening inside me in that silence, because it was not humiliation. It had been humiliation once, years ago, at that same joke told across my mother's good china. But 6 years of quiet, patient, deliberate construction had changed the chemistry of how that particular sentence landed in my body. What I felt, sitting there in my charcoal dress with 200 faces turned toward me, was something closer to recognition. There it was again, the unemployed one. The same 3 words, worn smooth from 6 years of repetition. And for the first time, I understood with total clarity that my sister had just handed me, in front of every witness who mattered, the exact opening I had spent 6 years quietly, unintentionally, preparing to use. That was when the phone buzzed against the tablecloth beside my water glass. I looked down. It was a message from Priya, sent at exactly 6:58 that evening, 4 words long. Final audit file attached. I looked up and found David Chen's eyes across the room, 2 tables over from Deborah and Grant, and he gave me the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. The nod of a man who has been waiting 11 months for a signal he was not certain would ever come. I stood up. I want to describe exactly how I stood, because the room noticed the difference immediately, the way a room always notices when someone moves with purpose instead of retreat. I did not stand abruptly. I did not stand with my face flushed or my hands shaking. I rose the way I used to rise at the head of a conference table managing a $200 million budget. Unhurried, entirely composed. A woman who had done this before and intended to do it correctly. Someone handed me a microphone, because that is simply what happens at weddings when the mother of the groom stands up looking like she has something to say. And I did not reach for it right away. I let the room finish settling into its uncomfortable quiet first. "Thank you, Deborah," I said finally. And my voice, when it came out, was level and clear and carried easily across the ballroom. The voice I had spent 6 years learning to keep steady, no matter what was said to me across a dinner table. That's a very generous toast. I let the smallest pause sit there, just long enough for the irony to register on a few faces near the front. I do want to clarify one small detail, though, since you brought it up in front of everyone who's here tonight. You've called me the unemployed one for 6 years now. At Thanksgiving, at Mom's birthday, at Mom's funeral, actually, which I remember quite clearly. A few gasps, quiet ones, rippled through the nearest tables. I let it go every single time, because I decided a long time ago that my dignity wasn't going to depend on winning an argument at a dinner table. But since you've decided tonight is the night to make it a matter of public record, I think it's only fair that the record actually be accurate. I looked deliberately toward David Chen, who rose from his seat with the quiet, unhurried competence of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind more than once, though he would later tell me he never actually believed it would happen at the wedding itself. "Some of you know David Chen as a family friend," I said. "That's true, as far as it goes. What most of you don't know is that David is also the managing partner of North Star Holdings, a private investment firm." I paused, and I felt the room's attention sharpen into something almost physical. North Star Holdings is the majority shareholder of Prescott Hospitality Group. We hold 61% of the company. We financed the $14.2 million rescue package that kept this venue and 4 other properties and roughly 400 jobs from going under 18 months ago, after a resort expansion went badly wrong. I heard Walter Prescott's chair scrape back at the family table near the front, his face a portrait of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the last year and a half of his professional life. "I am the sole beneficial owner of North Star Holdings," I said. "I have been for 6 years, during which time my sister has called me the unemployed one at every family gathering we have both attended." I let my eyes find Deborah's face for the first time since I'd stood up, and I watched the color draining out of it in real time, the particular gray pallor I remembered from Grant's face at that dinner in Westchester 6 months earlier. "I run a bookkeeping thing, Deborah. You were right about that much." The ballroom had gone entirely, completely silent, 200 people holding 200 breaths, waiting to see what came next. And I want you to understand that even in that silence, even with every advantage now sitting visibly in my hands, I did not feel triumphant. I felt, more than anything, tired and sad, and ready, finally, after 6 years, to stop protecting people who had never once protected me. "There's one more thing," I said, and I looked, this time, directly at Grant, who had gone so pale beside my sister that a woman at the neighboring table would later describe his face as the color of the tablecloth. "As majority shareholder of Prescott Hospitality Group, I have a fiduciary obligation to disclose material findings from a completed internal audit of company escrow accounts." I did not raise my voice. I have never once needed to raise my voice to make a sentence land like a verdict. That audit identified $86,400 diverted from the Ashford Manor wedding vendor escrow account over the past 14 months, routed through a series of transfers to a personal account belonging to the company's chief financial officer. Grant did not stand up. Grant, I am told by 3 separate guests who described the moment to me afterward, simply sat very still, both hands flat on the tablecloth, staring at a point somewhere past my shoulder, the exact posture of a man watching the entire architecture of his life come down around him in real time. Deborah found her voice before Grant did, which did not surprise me, because Deborah had never once in her life been comfortable sitting inside a silence she had not chosen herself. "This is insane," she said, her voice climbing toward the register I recognized from every argument of our childhood. "This is completely insane. You cannot possibly stand up at your own son's wedding and accuse my husband of embezzlement in front of 200 people. This is unhinged, Eleanor. This is exactly the kind of unstable behavior that—" "Deborah," Sophie's voice cut across the ballroom before I could respond. "And I want you to understand what that moment meant to me. Because I had spent 6 years building a life that required no rescue from anyone. And here was my new daughter-in-law, 26 years old, standing at her own wedding reception to defend a mother-in-law she had known for barely a year, simply because it was the right thing to do, and she had never once been someone who hesitated to do the right thing in front of an audience. My father built this company from one in," Sophie said, her voice shaking with a fury I had not yet seen from her in the months I'd known her. "If what Eleanor is saying is true, and given that she just told this entire room she owns the majority of it, I am fairly confident it is true, then you do not get to call this insane. You get to sit down." Walter Prescott stood then, a heavy-set man in his early 60s with the weathered, capable face of someone who had spent 3 decades building something with his hands, as much as his balance sheet, and he did not look at Deborah at all. He looked at Grant, and his voice, when it came, was quiet in the particular way that quiet voices become more frightening than shouting ever could. "Grant," he said. "My office. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. He paused. Bring your attorney. I want to pause the story here, in the middle of that silence, because I know some of you watching are waiting for the moment I finally allow myself to feel the satisfaction this whole story seems to be building toward. I promise you it is coming. But I want to be honest about what I actually felt in that ballroom, in the seconds after Walter Prescott sat back down, and the string quartet, utterly unequipped for this particular moment, began, absurdly, to play again. Some soft instrumental nobody in that room was listening to anymore. What I felt was not vindication. Not yet. What I felt was the strange, hollow ache of watching a version of my sister I had always suspected existed finally step, fully lit, into a room full of witnesses. I had wanted, for 6 years, for someone else to see what I saw. Now 200 people had seen it in the span of 90 seconds, and it did not feel like winning. It felt like grief, arriving late, for a relationship I had been quietly mourning long before that night. Priya Nair rose from her table near the back and walked forward, carrying a slim leather folder, and handed it to David Chen, who opened it briefly, confirmed something with a glance, and closed it again. The full audit findings, along with the transaction documentation and the loyalty program records establishing the pattern of losses at the Golden Horseshoe Casino in Atlantic City, have already been forwarded to Prescott Hospitality Group's outside legal counsel and to the company's board, David said, his voice carrying the same measured, unhurried authority I had come to rely on for 6 years. This is not a spontaneous accusation made in the heat of a family argument. This has been under review for 4 months, under standard governance protocols. Mr. Voss's removal from escrow authority was already implemented weeks ago, disguised as a routine internal controls update, precisely so that this evening would not have to become what it just became. He looked, briefly, at me. Eleanor asked that this wait until after the wedding. I think everyone in this room understands, now, why that was no longer possible. The room did not erupt the way you might expect a room to erupt after news like that. It did something quieter and in some ways more unsettling, which was that 200 people began, almost simultaneously, to lean toward the people beside them and speak in the low, urgent murmur of a crowd, trying to confirm with each other that they had all just heard the same impossible thing. I caught fragments of it drifting toward the head table, disconnected words rising out of the general hum. Majority shareholder, escrow, Atlantic City. My own cousin Patricia, 3 tables back, had lowered her hand from her mouth just enough to whisper something to her husband, and I watched him shake his head slowly, the particular slow shake of a man recalculating 6 years of holiday conversations in real time. Deborah was the first to try to claw the room back, because Deborah had never once in her adult life allowed a silence to belong to someone else for very long. "This is a private family matter," she said, her voice pitching upward, the champagne flush in her cheeks now looking less like celebration and more like fever. "Whatever internal audit nonsense you people are talking about, this is not the place, Eleanor. You had to do this here, at Michael's wedding, in front of everyone, when you could have called me, when you could have handled this like family instead of like some kind of corporate takeover." "Like family," I repeated, and I want you to notice, because I noticed it myself in the moment, how quiet my own voice stayed even as hers climbed. I did not raise mine to meet hers. I have found, across 6 years of learning exactly how much power lives inside restraint, that a raised voice gives an audience permission to stop listening to the words and start watching the spectacle instead. And I did not want this room watching a spectacle. I wanted them listening. "You are right that I could have called you privately, Deborah. I want to be honest about that in front of everyone here, because I think you deserve at least that much honesty, even tonight. David and I discussed exactly that option 4 months ago, when this audit first surfaced. We decided to wait until after the wedding, specifically so that Michael and Sophie would not have their day touched by any of this. I paused, and I let that pause do the work silence always does better than accusation. You are the one who stood up with a microphone tonight and decided the unemployed one needed one more turn in front of an audience. I did not choose this moment, Deborah. You did. I am simply the one who happened to be holding something heavier than you expected when you handed me the floor. I watched something in her face give way then. Not collapse entirely, not yet. That would come later, in a quieter room with far fewer witnesses. But something in the architecture of her certainty cracked visibly. The particular expression of a person realizing in real time that the story she has told herself for years about who holds the power in a relationship has just been proven catastrophically wrong. She opened her mouth once more and closed it again without speaking, which I do not believe I had ever once, in 38 years of being her sister, seen Deborah Voss do. Linda Prescott rose from her seat then, quietly, and made her way toward a cluster of guests near the dance floor who I recognized, from the seating chart I had helped assemble months earlier, as several of Prescott Hospitality Group's longtime board members and a family friend who happened to write a widely read regional business newsletter. I understood exactly what Linda was doing, because I would have done the same thing in her position. She was managing the room, quietly, the way capable women have always managed rooms on behalf of husbands too stunned to do it themselves, making sure that whatever story left that ballroom tonight would carry the truth of Grant's theft and Walter's swift response to it, rather than curdling, by morning, into something messier and less fair to the family that had built Ashford Manor with their own hands. I caught her eye once across the room, and she gave me the smallest nod, one competent woman to another, an acknowledgement that needed no further words attached to it. Richard found a moment, too, in the middle of all of it, to lean toward me from his seat 2 tables over, close enough that only I could hear him. "I had no idea," he said, and his voice carried none of the easy confidence I remembered from our marriage, only something smaller and more honest. "About any of it. The old job, the company, none of it. I'm sorry, Elle. I should have asked more questions when you told me you'd been laid off. I just took the easy version, same as everyone else." I told him it was all right, though I am not certain, even now, that it entirely was. And I understood, hearing him say it, that this was as close to an apology as Richard Doyle was ever likely to offer for the 4 months of silence that had preceded my own quiet unraveling all those years ago. I accepted it anyway, because I had learned, somewhere in the 6 years since, that accepting an apology does not require you to pretend the original wound never happened. It simply means you are choosing not to carry it forward into whatever comes next. I looked, once, toward Grant, because I wanted to see his face before he spoke. And what I saw there was not defiance, not even the mild condescension he had always aimed at me across 100 dinner tables. What I saw was a man doing arithmetic he had clearly been avoiding for months, watching every avenue of denial close in front of him one at a time, the way a house of cards collapses not all at once, but floor by floor, each one taking the one below it down with it. Sophie stood beside her father now, her wedding dress catching the candlelight, her jaw set in an expression I had come to recognize in the short time I had known her, as the specific look she wore when she had decided something was worth fighting for and had no intention of backing down. Walter Prescott had not sat back down. He remained standing at his table, arms crossed, watching his CFO of 9 years with the particular stillness of a man who has already made his decision and is simply waiting, out of some last vestige of professional courtesy, to hear what excuse might be offered before he acted on it. I thought, in that suspended moment before Grant finally spoke, of every family that had trusted Ashford Manor with a deposit over the past 14 months. Couples I had never met, planning their own weddings at the same venue where my son had just married, trusting that the money they had saved and scraped together sat safely waiting for the most important day of their lives. I thought of them because I wanted this reveal to be, in the end, about more than my own 6 years of accumulated hurt. I wanted it to matter that other people's trust had been protected too, that the same forensic patience that had once cleared my own name from a false accusation had now, quietly, without anyone's knowledge until this exact moment, protected strangers I would likely never meet from a theft they would never have known to look for themselves. That thought steadied me more than any triumph over my sister ever could have. The candles along the head table had burned low enough now that the wax had begun to pool visibly around their bases, and somewhere behind me, I heard a server quietly usher 2 curious young flower girls, Sophie's nieces, back toward a side table away from the adults. A small kindness in the middle of everything else unraveling that I noticed and appreciated more than I could say. The string quartet had stopped entirely now, bows resting in their laps. 4 young musicians watching the unfolding scene with the wide, uncertain eyes of people who had been hired to provide ambiance for a joyful evening, and found themselves instead as witnesses to something considerably heavier. Grant finally spoke, and his voice came out smaller than I had ever heard it. A voice with none of the mild condescension he had used on me across 100 family dinners. "I was going to pay it back," he said, to no one in particular, to the tablecloth, to the ruins of the evening. I had a system. I was up, at first. I was actually up. And then... He stopped himself, perhaps recognizing, even in that moment, how thin the sentence sounded out loud. "You stole from other people's weddings, Grant," Sophie said, her voice steady now, cold in a way I recognized because I had spent years cultivating that exact same coldness myself. "Families who trusted this venue with their deposits. Families who are going to walk down that same aisle in 3 weeks, in 6 weeks, in September, trusting that their money was safe. You took $86,000 of it to gamble in Atlantic City." She shook her head slowly. "My father built this company so people could trust us with the most important day of their lives. You gambled that trust away for a card table." Deborah, to her credit, or perhaps simply to her survival instinct, had gone entirely silent, the fight draining out of her posture as she looked back and forth between her husband's stricken face and my perfectly composed one, arriving, I think, at the same realization the whole room was arriving at simultaneously. That the woman she had spent 6 years calling the unemployed one had just, without raising her voice, without a single dramatic gesture, dismantled her entire family's standing at a wedding attended by 200 witnesses, using nothing but the truth, delivered at exactly the moment she chose to deliver it. I am going to tell you, now, everything that happened in the hours, days, and months that followed that ballroom. Because the reveal itself, satisfying as it was never actually the point of this story. The point was always what came after. Once the truth was finally sitting out in the open where nobody could pretend not to see it anymore. Walter Prescott did not wait until the following morning to act, as it turned out, though he had said 9 o'clock in front of 200 witnesses. Out of some instinct, I think, to preserve at least the appearance of due process for a man he had trusted with his family's business for 9 years. Within an hour of the toast, Walter had pulled his general counsel aside in the Manor's library, a wood-paneled room lined with old hunting prints and leather armchairs, where the wedding coordinator had originally planned to stage the cake-cutting photographs. And by the time the reception's dessert course was served, a decision had already been reached that Grant Voss would be placed on immediate administrative leave, effective that night, pending a full, independent forensic review. Grant did not stay for dessert. I watched him leave through a side door near the kitchen. No jacket, his tie already loosened. Deborah trailing several steps behind him with an expression I had genuinely never seen on my sister's face before. Something between panic and disbelief. A woman watching the ground she had always assumed was solid reveal itself as considerably thinner than she'd understood. Michael found me at the head table a few minutes later, still in his tuxedo, and he did not say anything at first. He simply put his arms around me, the way he used to when he was small enough that I could still lift him off the ground. And he held on for a long moment before he finally spoke. "Mom," he said, his voice rough, "why didn't you ever tell me?" I did not have a perfect answer for him that night, and I am not sure I have found one since, beyond the truth I have already told you. That I built an entire second life in the quiet, deliberate belief that visibility was a risk I was not willing to take again after Superior Retail Corporation had taught me, at 2:14 on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly how quickly the people around you can decide to believe the worst version of you. I told Michael that I loved him too much to let him carry the weight of my anger at my own family, that I had wanted his childhood, and later his adulthood, to be uncomplicated by a war I had chosen to fight quietly on my own terms. He held my hands and told me, with a fierceness I had not expected from my gentle, easygoing son, that he wished I had trusted him with more of it, that he was not the fragile 21-year-old I had been protecting 6 years ago, and that watching his aunt humiliate me at his own wedding had been the single worst moment of his life until the exact second I stood up and ended it. Sophie found me not long after, still in her wedding dress, and she did something I will remember for the rest of my life. She knelt down beside my chair, careful of the ivory silk pooling around her knees, and she took both of my hands in hers. "I need you to know something," she said. "I would have loved you exactly the same either way. The company, the money, none of that changes what I already knew about you." She smiled, small and a little watery. "But I would be lying if I said it isn't extremely satisfying to know that my new mother-in-law owns the company my father's terrible CFO was stealing from." It was the first time all evening I actually laughed, a short, surprised sound that felt like the first real breath I had taken in 6 years. The days that followed the wedding moved with a strange, compressed velocity, the way major events in a family tend to accelerate once the first domino has fallen. Walter Prescott's independent forensic review, conducted by an outside firm with no connection to North Star Holdings, confirmed Priya's findings within 11 days, identifying the full pattern of diverted escrow funds and corroborating the Atlantic City gambling losses through financial records Grant's own attorney was ultimately forced to concede. Grant was formally terminated from Prescott Hospitality Group 2 weeks after the wedding, and Walter, acting on the advice of counsel and, I suspect, on a personal fury he had been controlling admirably in front of 200 wedding guests, elected to pursue restitution through both civil and criminal channels rather than quietly absorbing the loss the way some companies might, to avoid the embarrassment of a public case. Grant Voss was charged 4 months later with a single count of embezzlement under New York state law, having diverted funds from an escrow account he held in a fiduciary capacity, and he ultimately pled guilty rather than face a jury, in exchange for a sentencing recommendation that spared him significant prison time but did not spare him a felony record, a 5-year probation term, and a restitution order requiring him to repay the full $86,400 plus interest to Prescott Hospitality Group. He lost his CFO position, obviously, and I am told by people who still move in those regional finance circles that he has not found comparable employment since, that the name Grant Voss now returns. In any basic background search, a local news article with a headline no employer particularly wants attached to a candidate's name. I take no pleasure in describing his downfall, and I want that understood plainly, because I know some of you watching this are hoping for a version of triumph that revels in another person's ruin. That has never been who I am, not even at the height of everything I had to reckon with after Superior Retail. Grant's downfall was not something I engineered for satisfaction. It was the ordinary, unglamorous consequence of ordinary financial governance discovering an ordinary crime, one that happened to intersect, through no design of mine, with a family gathering my sister chose to turn into a public execution of her own making. Deborah's unraveling was slower, and in some ways harder to watch, though I want to be honest that I did not spend much time watching it directly, because in the weeks after the wedding, I made a decision I had been quietly circling for 6 years without quite having the courage, or perhaps simply the occasion, to act on. I stopped answering Deborah's calls. She called 11 times in the first 2 weeks after the wedding. I know the number precisely because I looked at my phone each time, watched her name appear on the screen, and let it ring through to voicemail, the way I imagined she had let so many of my quieter, smaller hurts ring through unanswered for 6 consecutive years. Her voicemails moved over those 2 weeks through nearly every emotional register I had come to expect from her. Outrage in the first few, that I had ambushed her and Grant at a family event, followed by a kind of wounded bewilderment, and finally, by the 9th or 10th message, something that sounded, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like actual fear. "Elle," she said in that last voicemail, her voice smaller than I had heard it since we were children. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know what to do. Grant is talking about, I don't even know, he's talking about selling the house, and I need my sister. Please call me back." I did not call her back that week. I want to be honest that this was not entirely strategy. Some of it was simply grief, arriving in its own time. The particular grief of finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of 6 years I had spent minimizing for the sake of peace. I spent that week doing something I had not allowed myself to do in a very long time, which was cry, properly, in my own kitchen, at my own table, for the sister I had wanted Deborah to be, and the sister she had, across so many holidays, so clearly chosen not to be instead. I finally called her back 19 days after the wedding, not because she had worn me down, but because I had, in that time, arrived at a clarity I wanted to deliver to her directly rather than let her assemble from silence. I told her that I was not interested in punishing her, that I had never wanted her marriage to collapse or her husband to face criminal charges, that none of what happened had been engineered as retribution for 6 years of holiday cruelty. I told her the truth, plainly, the way I had learned to tell every truth by then, that Grant had stolen money, that the audit had found it independently of any personal history between us, and that the timing of its disclosure had been forced entirely by her own choice to humiliate me at a podium in front of 200 people. You could have told me quietly, she said, her voice thin. Before the wedding. You could have warned me. I was going to, I told her. I had already decided to handle it after the wedding, privately, exactly so that Michael and Sophie's day wouldn't be affected by it. That was the plan, Deborah. Right up until you stood up with a microphone and decided the unemployed one needed to be humiliated one more time, in front of everyone who matters to us, on my son's wedding day. I let that sit for a moment. The way I had learned silence could do more work than any raised voice ever could. I have let you call me that for 6 years. At Thanksgiving, at Christmas, at Mom's funeral. I let it go every single time because I decided a long time ago that I would rather be underestimated than be someone who fights for scraps of respect at a dinner table. But I am done deciding that silence is the price of keeping peace with you. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I wondered if she had hung up. I don't know why I did it, she said finally, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she sounded like she meant it, rather than performing the sentence for an audience. I think I've always been a little afraid of you, honestly. Even when we were kids, you were always so, I don't know, capable. Mom used to say things about you that she never said about me, and I don't know. I think I turned it into something ugly instead of just admitting it made me feel small. I want to tell you that this conversation fixed everything, that my sister and I found our way back to some warm, uncomplicated closeness in the months that followed. That would be a comfortable ending, and it would also be a lie. And I promised myself a long time ago, sitting in that conference room on the 9th floor of Superior Retail Corporation, that I would rather tell you an uncomfortable truth than a comfortable fiction. What actually happened is that Deborah and I built, slowly and carefully over the following year, something smaller and more honest than what we'd had before. We speak now perhaps once every few weeks. She has, to her credit, never once again used the phrase, the unemployed one. Not because I demanded she stop, but because I think, finally, she understood exactly how much that phrase had cost, both of us, in ways that had nothing to do with money. Deborah and Grant sold the Westchester house 8 months after the wedding, once the restitution order and Grant's legal fees had finished eroding whatever savings they had left, and they moved into a considerably smaller rental 2 towns over. Grant found work eventually, not in finance, but as an operations coordinator at a regional distribution warehouse, a job that pays, I am told, less than a third of what he made as Prescott Hospitality Group's CFO. I do not know whether Deborah has forgiven him for what his gambling cost their marriage as thoroughly as their finances. I know only that they are still together, still trying, in the particular, quiet, humbled way that people try when the version of themselves they'd built their whole identity around has finally, publicly, come apart. Walter Prescott, for his part, called me himself 8 days after the wedding, not through David Chen, not through any intermediary, but directly, his voice carrying the particular gravel of a man who had spent 3 decades building a company on the strength of trust and had just learned, in the most humiliating way imaginable, exactly how badly that trust had been abused by someone he'd hired personally. I owe you an apology, he said, for every ounce of condescension anyone in your family has ever aimed at you in front of my daughter's future company. He laughed, a short, rueful sound, and I owe you a considerably more serious conversation about how we restructure the CFO role, since apparently my majority shareholder has better financial instincts than the man I hired to run the books. That conversation led, over the following months, to something I had not anticipated when I first structured North Star's rescue financing 18 months earlier. an invitation, extended by Walter personally, for me to step into an active advisory role on Prescott Hospitality Group's board, no longer as an anonymous majority shareholder hidden behind David Chen's signature, but publicly, under my own name as Eleanor Hartwell, Vice Chair. I accepted, after several weeks of consideration, not because I needed the title. North Star Holdings had already made me more financially secure than I had ever imagined being back at that kitchen table 6 years earlier, but because I had spent 6 years building a life defined by careful invisibility, and I found, once the truth was finally sitting out in the open, that I did not actually want to disappear back into anonymity. I wanted, for the first time since that conference room on the 9th floor, to simply exist, visibly, as exactly who I had become. I want to tell you about my mother now, because there is a piece of this story I have been holding, deliberately, until this moment, the way I held so much else for so many years, waiting for the right time to set it down. 3 years before Michael's wedding, when my mother, Marion Hartwell, passed away after a short illness, her attorney handed me, along with the standard estate documents, a sealed envelope with my name on it in her handwriting, marked to be opened only privately. I did not open it that week or that month. I carried it, unopened, in the top drawer of my desk at North Star's small office in Beacon for nearly 3 years, telling myself I would open it when I was ready, though I think, if I am honest, I was simply afraid of what it might or might not contain. I opened it the week after Michael's wedding, sitting alone at my kitchen table, the same table where North Star Holdings had been born from a stack of consulting invoices and a severance check. My mother's handwriting, shakier than I remembered it, filled 2 pages. She wrote that she had known for years that something had happened at Superior Retail Corporation that was not the simple restructuring I had told the family, that a mother always knows when her child is protecting her from something rather than confiding in her, and that she had chosen, out of her own fear and her own limitations, not to press me on it. A choice she said she regretted more than almost any other in her life. She wrote that she had always been prouder of me than she had known how to say out loud, that Deborah's confidence had always been easier to celebrate publicly because it asked nothing complicated of her, while my competence had always felt, to a woman raised to believe daughters were meant to be charming rather than capable, slightly frightening to fully embrace. She wrote that she was sorry, and that she hoped, wherever I ended up, whatever I built, that I would remember she had seen me clearly, even when she had not said so. I sat with that letter for a long time. I want to tell you it healed everything instantly, the way these stories sometimes promise. It did not. But it gave me something I had not realized I was still missing, even 6 years into building an entire empire out of my own quiet competence. The knowledge that at least one person in my family had seen the truth of me all along, even in her silence, and had simply run out of time to say it while I could still hear it in her voice, instead of on a page. Michael and Sophie's marriage, in the year since that wedding, has become one of the great joys of my life. Not because of the company, not because of the money, but because of the particular tenderness with which they built a life together, unhurried, uncomplicated by the noise that surrounded their wedding day. Sophie calls me, some Sundays, simply to talk, and I have come to understand that the sympathy and warmth she showed me at that very first dinner in Beacon was never performance, the way so much of what I'd learned to expect from my own family had been. It was simply who she is, and I am grateful, every day, that my son found her before I ever knew her father's company would intersect with my own quiet second life. Prescott Hospitality Group, under new financial leadership and considerably tighter governance, has posted its strongest year in a decade. Ashford Manor hosted 94 weddings the year after Michael and Sophie's, each deposit now sitting exactly where couples are promised it will sit, in a segregated account audited quarterly by Priya Nair's growing team. A small, unglamorous fact that I take more pride in than almost anything else North Star Holdings has ever accomplished. There is something quietly satisfying about knowing that the same forensic patience that once cleared my own name from a false accusation now protects other families' trust in the most important day of their lives. And I think, if my younger self, sitting on the edge of my son's old bed with a cardboard box beside her, could see the shape of what that patience eventually built, she would not believe it. Not entirely. Not at first. But I think she would recognize it, eventually, as exactly the kind of quiet, load-bearing structure she had always, instinctively, known how to build. I think about my sister's toast often, more often, honestly, than I think about the reveal that followed it. I think about the particular cruelty of being called the unemployed one at my own son's wedding, in front of 200 people, by a woman who had spent 6 years mistaking my silence for weakness. And I think, mostly, about what I want you to take from this story, if you are watching it because some version of that same cruelty has happened to you, at your own family's table, in your own quiet years of being underestimated by people who were supposed to protect you instead. The lesson I have carried out of all of this is not, in the end, a lesson about revenge, though I understand why it might look that way from the outside. The lesson is this: the people who diminish you count on your compliance. They count on your silence reading as agreement, your patience reading as proof that they were right about you all along. But silence, chosen deliberately, is not the same thing as surrender. I spent 6 years letting my family believe the smallest possible version of my life, not because I owed them that smallness, but because I had decided, after everything Superior Retail Corporation put me through, that my worth would never again depend on any single person's willingness to see it clearly, including the people who shared my blood. I built an entire life in that silence, not out of spite, out of necessity, and then, eventually, out of a quiet, stubborn kind of pride that no dinner table insult could ever quite reach. And when the truth finally arrived, it did not arrive because I orchestrated a grand unveiling. It arrived because I had spent 6 years building something so solid, so patiently load-bearing, that when my sister finally handed me the microphone she thought she was using to humiliate me one last time, the truth simply walked into the room on its own, fully formed, and stood there until everyone had no choice but to see it. If you have ever been the unemployed one, the disappointing one, the one your family quietly decided to stop believing in, I want you to hear this clearly. Your worth was never theirs to calculate. Keep building, quietly if you have to, loudly when you are finally ready, and trust that the truth, given enough time and enough patience, has a way of walking into every room it needs to, exactly when it is needed most. Have you ever had to sit through a moment like that, watching your own family underestimate everything you had quietly built? I would love to hear your story in the comments below, wherever you are watching from tonight. And if this one meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own quiet strength, or your own 6 years of silence, or your own version of a room finally going still, do me a favor and hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that their patience is not weakness. It is, and it has always been, the most formidable thing about them. Thank you for staying with me through this one. I will see you in the next story.